The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then hummed to life as Carl Evans unlocked the back door of Brookdale High. He always arrived 15 minutes early, not because he had to, but because the silence before the night settled over the school like a blanket. The halls, once filled with laughter, footsteps, and slammed lockers, now echoed with a soft stillness. He liked it that way. Carl was 58. His knees reminded him of that every time he bent to pick up a dropped pencil or scrub the base of a locker. His uniform was always clean, though a little faded at the elbows. He wore the same dark blue jacket with his name stitched in red cursive over the heart. People passed him every day, teachers with arms full of papers, students glued to phones, but few ever read the name. Fewer still said it out loud. That suited Carl just fine. He moved like someone who'd been doing this forever, and he had, more or less. 2 decades of keys and mops and late-night classrooms, no awards, no plaques, just a rhythm. Clean room 112. Mop down science hall. Clear gum from under the cafeteria tables. A quiet kind of purpose. At 3:48 p.m., he slipped on his gloves. At 3:49, the day staff clocked out with barely a nod. By 4 o'clock, Carl was alone. The clatter of his cartwheels rolling over tile floors was the only conversation left in the building. Sometimes he'd pause outside a classroom just to look in. Not at anything in particular, just the remnants of teenage energy. Doodles left on whiteboards, backpacks forgotten beneath desks, a lone paper airplane by a window. It reminded him that the world kept moving, even when you weren't a part of it. He wasn't bitter. Life had taken turns, some sharp, some cruel. But Carl had long since stopped asking why. He didn't need a classroom of his own. He didn't need anyone to clap for him. There was something sacred, almost noble, in making sure things were ready for the next day, that when the doors opened again at 7:30 a.m., everything looked clean, safe, normal, like someone had been watching over it all night. Carl never expected anyone to notice the janitor. He'd become good at being invisible. But that was before the boy, before the nights in the library, before the one small act that would echo far beyond the walls he cleaned. That night, as he swept past the trophy case and into the quiet dark of the main corridor, he had no idea the story was already beginning. The first time Carl noticed the boy, he barely registered it. Just a kid, maybe a freshman, hunched over a book in the corner of the school library as the sky outside melted into the indigo of early evening. Carl was wiping down the glass doors near the entrance when he glanced through the library windows and saw the flicker of movement, the outline of someone still there. He checked his watch. Male 5:32. Too late for study hall. Too early for the building to be fully empty. Maybe he was waiting for a parent running late, Carl figured. It happened. Kids stuck waiting for a ride, eyes fixed on their phones or their books, or nothing at all. The next day, the boy was there again. Same spot, same slouched posture. This time he had a peanut butter cracker in one hand and a tattered backpack at his feet, the zipper barely holding its contents inside. His hair was uneven, like it had been cut in a rush. His shoes were too big. Carl passed the window again without saying anything. Not his place to interfere. He was there to clean, not ask questions. By the 4th day, Carl began to linger just a second longer. The boy never spoke, never looked up. But he was always there, quiet, still, small, too small. His clothes hung off him like they'd once belonged to someone older, someone who'd outgrown them. Carl started adjusting his route, saving the library for last, not because he had to, but because he wanted to keep watch without watching. He'd sweep near the door, slow and methodical, pretending not to notice the way the boy always glanced toward the exit whenever a sound echoed through the building. The way his eyes darted, like he was ready to flee at any moment. He didn't belong there that late. That much was clear. But no teacher seemed to notice. No administrator asked about the kid who stayed behind long after the bell rang. So Carl did what he always did, observed quietly, kept his distance, said nothing. But by the end of the second week, something in him shifted. He didn't know the boy's name, but he knew what it felt like to be left behind when the building emptied. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Carl started leaving the lights on in the library just a little longer each night, just in case the boy needed to believe someone knew he was still there. The library was supposed to close at 6. At least, that's what the posted sign said, in clean laminated letters no one read. But sometimes Carl would walk past at 6:15, 6:30, and still see the glow from inside. No librarian, just the boy, always in that same chair, book open, body folded in on itself like he was trying to disappear between the pages. One night, a little after 7, Carl found the lights still on. He pushed the door open quietly, expecting to call out and find the room empty. But the boy was there, head down, arms crossed on the table, fast asleep. Carl didn't say anything, just stood for a moment, mop in hand, staring at the fragile rise and fall of the boy's shoulders. There was a half-empty vending machine snack wrapper near his elbow. Crumpled cheese crackers, the kind that left orange dust on your fingers for hours. That night, Carl didn't finish mopping the library. He backed out slowly, turned off the lights except for one by the exit, and left the door unlocked. If the kid woke and needed to leave, he could. But it wasn't just once. Over the next few weeks, Carl saw it again. A wrapper tucked into a book, a cup of water from the fountain, a sweatshirt used as a pillow. Marcus, he'd finally heard a teacher call him that in passing, had turned the far corner of the library into something more than a study space. It was a shelter, a hiding place. Carl began to pay closer attention. The kid wasn't just lingering after school. He was staying because he didn't have anywhere else to go. He never asked for help, never looked like he wanted anyone to notice. But Carl noticed. And it ate at him. There was a rule in Carl's world. Don't get involved. You clean, you fix, you disappear before the sun rises. But the memory of that too-thin boy curled up at a table like a makeshift bed followed Carl home. It waited for him when he set down his keys at night. It showed up in his dreams. Kids weren't supposed to sleep at school. They weren't supposed to survive on vending machine scraps and silence. Carl had spent a lifetime working in forgotten corners. He knew what it meant to be overlooked. But something about this, about Marcus, made him realize maybe some corners aren't meant to stay forgotten. The next night, Carl packed an extra granola bar in his coat pocket. He told himself it was for later, maybe during his break, but he knew that wasn't true. When he passed the library, Marcus was in his usual spot, head low over a book, eyes distant. The same cracked backpack sat slumped beside him like a tired companion. Carl didn't stop or speak. He just walked in during his usual sweep, left the granola bar at the edge of the desk, and moved on without a glance. He didn't wait for a thank you. The next night, he added an apple, placed it gently beside the granola bar like it had always been there. Marcus didn't say anything, but both were gone by the time Carl returned to lock up. There was a quiet power in that exchange. No questions, no explanations, just an offering, as if to say, I see you, even if no one else does. One night, Carl folded a small piece of paper in half and scribbled on it with blocky, awkward handwriting, the kind that came from hands more used to pushing brooms than holding pens. Hang in there. That was all it said. No signature, no name. He slid it under the granola bar and walked away before the boy could look up. The next evening, Carl found the note tucked between two books on the edge of the table, carefully folded back, the crease neat and unbroken, as if it had been read more than once. He didn't need a reply. The silence between them had become something sacred. A quiet agreement built not on words, but on presence. Each day, Carl brought something small, a banana, a cheese stick, a pack of peanut butter crackers. Sometimes he left them without notes, sometimes with short messages. "You've got this. Keep going." Almost Friday. Marcus never acknowledged them with more than a slight nod, but his eyes started to linger a bit longer when Carl passed. Not full eye contact, just enough to say, "I know it's you." Carl never asked about the boy's life. He didn't need the details. He could see the hunger in Marcus's careful way of unwrapping each item, in the way he tucked the extras into his backpack like precious things. He recognized it. A hunger not just for food, but for someone to notice, someone to care, without prying. It wasn't much, just snacks, just notes. But in a world that so often walked past people like Marcus and people like Carl, it was enough to begin a fragile bridge made of quiet acts and unspoken understanding. The routine settled in like an old coat, worn, familiar, comforting in its silence. Every evening, before pushing his cart into the science wing, Carl would veer left, duck into the library, and leave something small on the corner of the desk. Always the same desk, always the same boy. A sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a juice box, trail mix in a Ziploc bag, sometimes a note, sometimes not. Marcus never acknowledged the gesture beyond a subtle shift in posture, a quiet nod when Carl passed by with the mop. But the food was always gone by night's end. No crumbs, no wrappers, just absence. Carl never said a word about it, never looked directly at the boy while he worked nearby. He'd sweep around him like Marcus was part of the furniture, solid, unmoving, quietly present. He didn't need thanks. That wasn't why he did it. Carl had long since learned that dignity was a delicate thing, especially when you were young and alone and trying desperately not to seem like either. For someone like Marcus, gratitude came with risk. Acknowledging the help might mean acknowledging the need. And need was something Marcus wore like an old bruise, hidden but always there. So Carl gave without comment, and Marcus received without reply. They were two ghosts passing in the halls of a place meant to be bright and loud and full of life. And yet somehow, in that quiet corner of the school, they built something, a thread of connection. Thin, invisible, but real. Teachers never asked where Marcus went after hours. No one seemed to notice. But Carl noticed. And each time he left a piece of fruit or a wrapped cookie, he did it knowing it might be the only act of care Marcus received that day. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about being a hero. Carl didn't think of himself that way. He was just a janitor, a man who had known the sharp edge of being forgotten, who had once sat hungry in a warm room and felt the sting of being invisible. And maybe that's why he kept doing it. Because once upon a time, no one noticed him either. So he noticed Marcus. And that was enough. It was late, later than usual. Most of the classrooms were dark, the hum of the vending machines echoing through the empty halls. Carl moved with his usual rhythm, mop gliding over the tiles outside the library. The boy was there, as always, buried in a book, the glow of the overhead light pooling around him like a quiet spotlight. Carl had just dropped off a peanut butter sandwich and a bottle of water on the table. No note this time. He didn't expect one back. The routine had become so normal, it almost didn't register anymore. Just something he did, like flipping off the lights or locking the gym door. He was halfway down the corridor, mop handle in hand, when he heard it. "Thanks." Just one word. barely louder than the squeak of the wheels on his cleaning cart. But it stopped Carl mid-step. He didn't turn around, didn't want to make a moment out of it. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, and kept sweeping. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't the word itself. It was how Marcus said it. Tentative, careful, like he was testing how it would feel to speak it out loud, like maybe he didn't say it often. Or maybe it had been a long time since he'd had someone to say it to. Carl didn't need more. That single word held more weight than a speech ever could. It was an opening, however small. A crack in the wall Marcus had spent so much time building. He passed by the library again later that night, long after the sandwich had disappeared. Marcus was still there, but he looked up this time. Not long. Just a quick glance, eyes meeting for a breath before returning to his book. Carl nodded again. It was enough. They didn't need to talk. The silence between them had always said more than words. But now, it had a name. Thanks. A bridge built with just one word. The snacks came first, then the notes. Then, one night, Carl slid a geometry textbook onto the table next to the usual sandwich and juice box. It wasn't new, its corners were bent, the cover creased, but it was clean, and he dusted it carefully before placing it beside the food. He didn't know if Marcus would use it. He hadn't planned to bring it, not really. It had been sitting on the lost and found shelf for months, never claimed. Something about the boy's quiet focus, the way he clung to those library books like lifelines, had made Carl think maybe he needed more than food. The next evening, the book was still there, but open, pages marked with a folded napkin. The night after that, Carl added a pack of sharpened pencils, held together with a rubber band. He left a notebook too, spiral-bound, blue cover, clean. No note this time, just tools. By the end of the week, the notebook had scribbles in it, equations, diagrams. Carl caught a glimpse once as he passed, nothing neat, nothing polished, but effort. Attempt. That meant something. Carl didn't ask where Marcus learned to study or how he understood things on his own. He just noticed the way the boy's head tilted when he concentrated, the pencil tapping lightly against his lip as he worked. He noticed the way his shoulders, once permanently slouched in defeat, had begun to square ever so slightly with purpose. It wasn't much, just math problems on lined paper. But to Carl, it looked like hope. He began leaving other things, history worksheets, vocabulary lists, science articles clipped from old magazines. All quiet, all without explanation. Marcus used them all. Sometimes, Carl wondered where he was getting the strength to keep coming back, to stay late, to work so hard when no one seemed to be watching. But then again, someone was watching. Carl didn't need to say it out loud, didn't need to explain why a janitor knew where the extra textbooks were, or why he happened to have a ruler and highlighters tucked in the corner of his cart. He just showed up, quietly, steadily. And every time Marcus opened a new page, every time he underlined a word or solved an equation, Carl saw more than schoolwork. He saw a kid who still believed there was a way forward. It was a Friday evening when Carl finally heard the pieces fall into place. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, was just emptying the trash in the counselor's office when two voices drifted in from the hallway. Quiet, hushed. One of them was Mrs. Delaney, the school social worker. The other was a teacher Carl didn't recognize by voice, but the name they spoke stopped him mid-motion. Marcus Hayes. He stood still, hand resting on the plastic rim of the bin, listening as the teacher asked if the boy was okay, said he'd noticed Marcus seemed exhausted, sometimes wearing the same shirt for days, that he worked hard but looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Mrs. Delaney sighed, low and tired. His mother checked into a rehab program back in August. His dad hasn't been around in years. Marcus is staying at a youth shelter off Glenwood. The words settled in Carl's chest like bricks. He gets himself to school every day, she continued. Walks nearly 2 miles. Keeps his grades up. Won't talk to anyone unless he has to. Smart kid. Scared, though. He's hanging on by a thread. Carl didn't move. Not until their voices faded down the hall. He already knew Marcus was different. The way he sat alone. The way he watched everything. Guarded and quiet. Now he understood why. The hunger hadn't just been for food. It had been for safety. For routine. For something that felt even a little bit like normal. That night, Carl cleaned slower than usual. His mind kept circling back to the image of Marcus, hunched over his homework, trying to solve problems while carrying burdens no 14-year-old should have to bear. A shelter, no parents, still showing up, still fighting. He remembered what that fight felt like. He'd lived it once, different names, different circumstances, but the same desperate need to keep it all from falling apart. Later, as he passed by the library, Carl left a sandwich and a small note. "You're doing better than you think. I'm proud of you." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. Marcus wouldn't say anything about it the next night, or the one after. But his eyes lingered longer now when Carl passed by. He sat a little straighter. And when he opened his notebook, the pencil in his hand didn't tremble quite so much. The boy was struggling, but he was still standing. And Carl would keep showing up, one small act at a time, to make sure he didn't fall. The library was nearly empty, save for the sound of a pencil scratching against paper and the occasional sigh from the boy at the corner desk. Carl was doing his rounds, but his cart moved slower that night, lingering by the entrance. He watched as Marcus leaned over his notebook, erased something, then stared at the page like it had personally offended him. Carl recognized the look. Frustration, layered with exhaustion. A silent question. What's the point of trying if nothing makes sense? He waited a beat, then walked over. Marcus didn't look up. Carl nodded toward the paper. "Algebra." The boy muttered something close to a yes. Carl studied the problem from where he stood. It was a mess of variables, fractions, and parentheses. "You flip the sign here," he said gently, tapping one corner of the page. "After you move the 2 over." Marcus blinked, then frowned, looking down. He hadn't expected help, hadn't asked for it, but he didn't pull away either. Carl waited. "Can I?" he asked, motioning toward the empty chair. Marcus nodded, just once. Carl sat slowly, knees cracking in quiet protest. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notepad and a stubby pencil. Then he rewrote the problem, slowly and deliberately, speaking just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Okay, you've got your equation. Now isolate the variable. Think of it like clearing clutter off a desk, just one step at a time." Marcus watched, eyes narrowing in concentration. "Like this?" he asked, pointing to his own paper. Carl smiled, small and proud. "Exactly like that." They worked in silence after that. Marcus scribbled problems, Carl corrected with a word or two, always calm, always patient. He never made the boy feel slow, never rushed him, just steady encouragement, as if math were something they could untangle together. By the time the hour passed, Marcus had finished every problem on the page, and got most of them right. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a breath that sounded like relief. Carl stood, gathering his notepad. "You've got a good brain," he said, matter of fact. "You just needed someone to slow it all down." Marcus nodded again. He didn't say thank you this time, but he didn't need to. Carl could see it in the way the boy sat taller, in the way the pencil no longer trembled in his hand. Sometimes, all it took was one person to make a hard thing feel possible. And that night, Carl Evans, quiet janitor, forgotten by most, became the best kind of teacher. The kind who shows up when no one else does. The rain came hard that night, drumming against the windows in steady rhythm, blurring the world outside into gray. The school felt quieter than usual, muffled under the weight of the storm. Carl was late getting to the library. He'd had to mop up a leak near the gym. But when he finally pushed open the door, Marcus was already there, a damp hood pulled low over his forehead, a small puddle forming beneath his sneakers. Carl didn't say anything, just nodded and set the usual sandwich and water on the table. Marcus didn't reach for them right away. His book lay open in front of him, but he wasn't reading, just staring at the page like the words had stopped making sense. Carl started to turn away when he heard it, quiet, almost unsure. "Do you ever get tired?" He paused, looked back. "Tired of what?" he asked gently. Marcus shrugged, eyes still fixed on the page. "Everything. Pretending you're fine when you're not. Showing up, doing the work, knowing no one really sees you." Carl moved slowly to sit in the chair across from him. The boy's face was pale under the fluorescent lights, dark circles beneath his eyes deeper than they should be for someone that young. "I used to," Carl said after a moment. "A long time ago." Marcus finally looked up. "What changed?" Carl thought about it. "I stopped expecting someone else to fix things for me, but I also stopped thinking I had to do it completely alone." There was silence after that. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with things unsaid. "My mom's been gone since August," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's in rehab. They told me it was temporary, but I don't think she's coming back." Carl said nothing, just listened. "I don't know where my dad is," Marcus added. "Never met him. It's just me, mostly. The shelter's okay, but it's not home. Nothing is." His shoulders hunched forward, as if expecting judgment. But Carl didn't offer pity or platitudes, just presence. "You keep showing up," Carl said softly. "That counts for something." Marcus's eyes shimmered, but he blinked quickly, forcing it down. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." Carl gave a small smile. "Maybe you needed to." The storm outside kept raging, wind curling around the corners of the building. But inside that quiet library, something softer settled between them. It wasn't a full story, not all the pain, not all the scars. But it was a beginning. And sometimes telling the truth to one person, just once, was enough to help you carry it a little longer. By mid-October, the change in Marcus was impossible to ignore, at least to those who were paying attention. His homework was not only turned in on time, but done with care, neatly written, even underlined in places. He raised his hand more in class, not often, but just enough to surprise the teachers who'd quietly labeled him as distant. His eyes didn't look as hollow, and there was a steadiness to his presence that hadn't been there before, like he was finding something solid to stand on. Mrs. Patel, his English teacher, mentioned it first in the break room. "Marcus Hayes is different lately, more focused, like someone's lit a fire under him." Mr. Dunning from algebra agreed. "He used to bomb every quiz. Now he's pulling a B average. Didn't think the kid even owned a calculator." They chuckled, shrugged, speculated. Maybe he got a new tutor. Maybe he was finally adjusting to the shelter. Maybe his mom was back in the picture. But no one thought to ask Marcus, and no one even glanced at Carl. He moved through the hallways the same way he always had, quiet, head down, mop in hand. He heard the conversations, caught the sideways praise, and tucked it away like a secret he wasn't meant to have. When he passed by Marcus in the halls, they gave no sign of knowing each other. No nods, no words. Just the faintest flicker of recognition, like the shared glance of two people who've survived the same storm. That was how Carl preferred it. He didn't want credit. He didn't want a spotlight. The best work he'd ever done in his life was the kind no one saw. Sometimes when the building was empty and Carl stood in the library alone, he'd trace his finger across the table where Marcus always sat. Still scratched and worn, but no longer a place of hiding. Now it felt like a desk of someone trying to move forward. Let the teachers whisper. Let them guess. Carl didn't need them to know the truth. He only needed Marcus to keep showing up. Most people assumed Carl Evans had always been a janitor, that he'd taken the job straight out of high school, found comfort in the quiet, and never wanted more. It was easier that way. People didn't ask questions when they thought they already knew the answers. But late at night, when the hallways were empty and the world had gone quiet, Carl sometimes let the old memories in. Back when he was 19, Carl had been a sophomore at a small state college, studying education. He wanted to teach history, not the dry textbook kind, but the living, breathing sort. Stories of real people, choices, consequences. He believed in the power of a good teacher. Believed once that he could become one. His mom worked nights at a diner, just like Jenny Miller's in another story, and his little sister Emily was still in middle school. Their father had left early, so it had always been the three of them. Then came the call. A car accident. A patch of black ice. His mother gone in an instant. Carl left school the next day. He didn't think about it. Emily needed someone, and there was no one else. He got a job in maintenance at a local warehouse, then later at the school, when the district offered steady hours and decent benefits. He told himself he'd go back, eventually. Finish the degree. Pick up where he left off. He never did. Emily grew up, moved away, became a nurse, married, sent Christmas cards Carl kept in a shoebox under his bed. And Carl stayed. The dream faded, not all at once, but slowly, like a photograph left in the sun. But he never stopped caring about kids, never stopped watching out for the quiet ones, the ones who slipped between the cracks. That's what he saw in Marcus. Not just a boy struggling through math problems, but a younger version of himself, smart, scared, and doing everything he could just to hold it together. Carl knew what it meant to sacrifice your future for someone else's survival. And maybe that's why he showed up every night with a sandwich, a pencil, a word of encouragement. Because though he'd never stood at the front of a classroom, never held a lesson plan or passed out report cards, he still found a way to teach. Not with lectures, but with presence, with patience, with kindness. And sometimes, that was enough. The last day of school before winter break came wrapped in bells and bustle. Students rushed through the halls in holiday sweaters, arms full of candy canes and gift bags, voices louder than usual. Teachers handed out half-hearted assignments and waved their goodbyes. The building pulsed with the anticipation of freedom. Carl felt none of it. He stood in the library doorway that afternoon, watching Marcus pack his worn backpack in slow, deliberate motions. There were no decorations taped to his locker, no friends calling his name. Just a boy in a frayed hoodie, zipping up everything he owned and slinging it over one thin shoulder. "You got someplace warm to go?" Carl asked, voice low. Marcus didn't answer right away. He shrugged. "Shelters open through the holiday," he said, eyes on the floor. "They let you stay all night, if it's below freezing." Carl nodded like he understood, even though the idea of spending Christmas Eve in a concrete room with folding chairs and vending machine meals made something twist in his gut. "All right then," Carl said quietly. "You take care of yourself." Marcus gave a small nod, and that was it. He disappeared through the back doors, swallowed up by the cold. That night, the school emptied out. The halls echoed differently. like something vital had slipped out the front doors along with the last bus. Most staff wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. The lights would stay off. The heat turned low. Only maintenance stayed on rotation. Carl volunteered for every shift. He told the district he didn't mind working through the break, said he'd repaint the chemistry lab, check the pipes, deep clean the gym mats. They didn't ask questions, just handed him the keys. But Carl had a different plan. Each morning, he unlocked the side door near the library. He'd turn on one soft lamp in the corner, just like always, and leave something warm on the table. Scrambled eggs in a thermos, a hot sandwich wrapped in foil, a banana, a cookie. He never waited, just placed it there and walked the building. Most days, by the time he circled back, the food was gone. No note, no thanks. Just the faintest imprint of a backpack on the chair and a napkin folded neatly on the table. Carl never saw Marcus during the break, not once. But he knew the boy had come, had eaten, had warmed his hands near the lamp before walking back out into the winter. And that was enough. Sometimes being there, even when no one sees you, is the most important job of all. When classes resumed in January, the cold still clung to the windows, but something about Marcus had changed. He walked into the school with his head a little higher, steps more purposeful. The shadows beneath his eyes hadn't vanished, but they no longer dragged him down. He still kept to himself, but now it felt like a choice, not a survival instinct. Carl noticed it first. He saw it in the way Marcus nodded at teachers in the hallway, even if only slightly. In the way he lingered after class, talking to Mr. Klein about lab assignments instead of disappearing into the quiet corners of the library. There was a spark now, a flicker of belief where there had once only been endurance. Then came the real surprise. It was late one afternoon when Carl passed the science lab and saw Marcus inside, not alone, but surrounded by students in white coats, laughing, measuring something into a beaker. He paused outside the doorway, mop in hand, pretending to clean the glass as he watched the boy who once flinched at every noise now raise his hand to volunteer an idea. Science club. He'd joined on his own. No one pushed him. No one told him to. Carl didn't go in. He never would. But when Marcus glanced toward the door for the briefest moment and saw Carl there, their eyes met. Marcus didn't look away this time. He smiled, small but real, and gave a quick nod. Carl nodded back. Then he moved on, leaving only the faintest trail of soapy water in his wake, his chest tight in a way he couldn't explain. He never told anyone how proud he was. He didn't need to. The boy who used to hide in the library after dark was standing in front of a whiteboard now, explaining theories with confidence in his voice. Carl had spent years wiping floors that no one noticed, fixing things before anyone knew they were broken. But this was different. He didn't just clean up the school anymore. He'd helped someone find a place in it. It was a Thursday afternoon when Principal Reynolds flagged Carl down in the main hallway, just outside the front office. She was holding a clipboard in one hand and a puzzled expression in the other. "Carl, got a minute?" He wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt loop and nodded. "Sure." She glanced down at her notes, then leaned in a little, voice dropping. "Have you noticed anyone hanging around after hours? A student, maybe. Some of the staff think someone's been sneaking in. Lights on in the library, missing snacks from the lounge. That sort of thing." Carl kept his face neutral, his eyes kind. Probably just kids being kids," he said, giving a slow shrug. "You know how they are. Always finding places to hide out." Reynolds narrowed her eyes slightly, like she was trying to read between the lines. "You haven't had to chase anyone out? No security issues?" "No, ma'am," he said calmly, not lying, not quite telling the truth. If I see anything out of the ordinary, I'll let you know. She studied him for a moment longer, then gave a short sigh. All right, just keep an eye out. We don't want any trouble, especially not in this weather. Carl nodded. Of course. She walked off, her heels clicking against the tile. Carl waited until she disappeared around the corner before heading back to his cart. He moved slowly, thoughtful. Trouble. That was always the word people reached for when something didn't fit neatly into a schedule or a policy. But what they didn't see, what they'd never seen, was that sometimes what looked like trouble was just someone trying to survive unnoticed. Marcus had never asked for anything. He hadn't broken into lockers or vandalized classrooms. He came in, studied, ate what was left for him, and disappeared before the sun rose. Carl knew the difference. He'd seen real trouble, and he'd seen boys like Marcus, fighting battles no one else could see, just trying to hold on. So when the principal asked if he'd seen anyone sneaking around, he smiled. Just kids being kids. Because sometimes the truth didn't need to be spoken to be protected. It just needed someone willing to carry it quietly. The years passed faster than Carl expected. One day Marcus was a too-thin freshman curled up in the shadows of the library, and suddenly he was 17, taller, shoulders broader, voice deeper. A senior now, with that quiet determination still etched into every movement, but something lighter in his eyes, like he'd finally started to believe he might actually make it. He wore the same old hoodie sometimes, sleeves still frayed, but he held himself differently. Confident. Present. The kind of quiet that didn't come from hiding, but from knowing who you are. He still came to the library in the evenings. Not every night, not like before. But enough. Sometimes he brought his laptop and worked in silence. Sometimes he sat with a sandwich Carl left behind, even though Marcus could afford his own food now, part-time job at a grocery store down the street, a scholarship application on his to-do list. And sometimes he just talked. Nothing heavy. Not anymore. He'd sit on the edge of a table while Carl swept nearby and tell stories about school, the teacher who kept calling him Martin even after 3 years, the lab partner who thought Saturn was a star, the girl from science club who might have been flirting with him, or just needed help with calculus. Carl listened, chuckling in the right places, nodding along like a father might. They didn't talk about the hard stuff anymore. They didn't need to. The worst of it had passed, or maybe just stopped owning every corner of Marcus's life. Now there was room for jokes, for plans, for imagining what came next. College tours, SAT prep recommendation letters. I think I want to study engineering, Marcus said one evening, peeling the label off his water bottle. Something with design, structures. I want to build things that last. Carl looked up from his mop, something catching in his throat. You already are, he said quietly. Marcus didn't reply, just smiled, eyes warm. They sat like that for a while. Man and boy, janitor and student. Nothing official binding them except the years they'd quietly carried one another. In a school where so many passed without ever looking up, they had seen each other. And that had been enough to change everything. The essay was part of a district-wide scholarship competition, open to all seniors, themed around the prompt, a person who changed your life. Most students wrote about parents, coaches, siblings. Some wrote about historical figures, celebrities, authors. Marcus submitted his at the last minute. No name on the pages, just his student ID number in the top right corner, as the guidelines required. He didn't want credit, not for himself, and not for the person he wrote about. He just wanted the truth to be heard. Once. The essay was quiet, not flowery or dramatic, just real. He wrote about a man with a worn uniform and calloused hands, a man who showed up long after the building had emptied out, who left small notes and warm meals without ever asking for a name or a story. A man who never said much, but somehow said exactly what Marcus needed. He didn't use Carl. He didn't say janitor. He didn't have to. I was invisible, and he saw me. That's it. That's everything, the essay read. He never asked why I was hungry. He just fed me. He never asked why I stayed late. He just left the light on. He never tried to fix me. He made space for me to fix myself. It was passed up the chain without Marcus knowing. One of the teachers on the review panel, Mrs. Patel, recognized the voice immediately. She'd taught Marcus since his freshman year. She forwarded it to the principal. The principal sent it to the school board. And within days, printed copies of the anonymous essay made their way into staff mailboxes. Some cried, some went quiet, some read it twice, 3 times. Carl never got a copy, not at first. But he noticed something had shifted. Teachers started greeting him by name in the halls. A few offered him coffee. The lunch lady called him sir, with a smile. Even Principal Reynolds paused one afternoon and said, "It's the quiet ones who do the loudest work." Carl didn't understand why. Not until Mrs. Patel caught him after his shift and handed him a folded sheet of paper. "You should read this," she said. "It's about someone you might recognize." Carl opened the pages slowly, carefully, like the words inside might break if handled too quickly. He read it in the supply closet, alone. By the time he finished, he was sitting on an overturned bucket, glasses fogged, heart full. He never told Marcus he'd read it. He didn't have to. Some truths speak loudest in silence. The staff lounge buzzed with conversation the morning after the essay began, making its quiet rounds. Most talked about how moving it was, how rare it was to read something so honest. A few speculated who the student might be, tossing out names like guesses in a game they didn't realize mattered. But Mrs. Delaney didn't guess. She knew. She'd worked with Marcus since his mother entered rehab. She'd seen the subtle shifts in him, where he sat, how he spoke, the quiet confidence that had slowly replaced silence. And she'd seen the way his eyes always trailed to Carl when they passed each other in the hallway. Never obvious, but never empty. There was something there, something deeper than respect, something like gratitude. She reread the essay twice in her office, then again once more just to be sure. There was no doubt. It was Carl. That evening she knocked on Principal Reynolds's door and closed it behind her. "It's about Carl," she said simply, holding up the paper. Reynolds glanced at it, frowning slightly. "The janitor?" Delaney nodded. "Marcus Hayes wrote this. I'd bet my job on it. And I think the whole school needs to know." Reynolds didn't answer immediately. She leaned back in her chair, studying the pages like she was seeing them for the first time. "I didn't know he'd been doing all this," she murmured. "He didn't want anyone to know," Delaney said gently. "That's the point. He helped because it needed to be done, not for recognition." The principal stared out the window, her brow creased. "We always say we care about the kids falling through the cracks," she said softly. "But we never ask who's holding the net." The next morning, Reynolds printed a fresh copy of the essay and placed it in a plain envelope. Then she walked it down to the custodial closet, knocked twice, and waited. Carl opened the door with a rag still in his hand. She offered him the envelope without a word. Carl looked at it, confused, then met her eyes. "You deserve to know what you've done," she said quietly. He didn't open it then, not in front of her. He just nodded, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and got back to work. But the next time Marcus passed him in the hall, their eyes met a little longer. And for the first time, Marcus smiled without hesitation. Carl smiled back. No words, no need. The weeks leading up to graduation moved like slow thunder, quiet at first, then all at once. Students buzzed through the halls in caps and cords, snapping pictures in front of lockers they once hid behind. Teachers handed out final exams with misty eyes. Seniors counted down their last days, their last classes, their last chances to say goodbye. Marcus Hayes wasn't the loudest or the most visible, but when the announcement came over the intercom, no one was surprised. "This year's valedictorian is Marcus Hayes." The applause that followed in the senior hallway was warm and genuine. A few clapped out of duty. Most clapped out of respect. Carl heard the announcement from the boiler room, where the radio crackled through a dusty speaker. He paused in the middle of replacing a belt on the ancient ventilation fan and let the words settle over him, like sunlight breaking through a long, gray morning. He didn't say anything about it when he saw Marcus that evening in the library. He just gave a small nod, the same one he'd given 100 times before. But Marcus didn't nod back this time. He stood, hands in the pockets of his jacket, and walked over to Carl where he was wiping down a windowsill. "Hey," Marcus said. "I wanted to ask you something." Carl looked up, expectant. "I know graduation's not really your thing," Marcus began, shifting slightly. "But I'd like you to come. Just as a guest, nothing official. Just someone I want there." Carl blinked, his hands stilled. "Me?" Marcus gave a small smile. "You were there for everything else. You might as well see the ending too." For a long moment, Carl didn't speak. Then he nodded, slowly, eyes soft. "I'll be there," he said. He didn't ask where to sit. He didn't ask if anyone else would know why he was there. He just made a note to polish his shoes and to take the day off, because sometimes being a guest meant everything, especially when the invitation came from someone you'd once fed in silence, now standing tall, ready to speak before a crowd. Not as the boy in the corner anymore, but as the one at the podium. The sun hung low over the stadium as Carl Evans stepped through the entrance gate, clutching his invitation in one hand and smoothing the front of his pressed shirt with the other. He'd polished his shoes that morning. It had taken an old toothbrush and a tin of wax he hadn't touched in years. His tie was borrowed, too wide, a little faded, but it was clean, and that felt like enough. The bleachers were already filling. Families with balloons, teachers in folding chairs, proud parents waving programs and cameras in every direction. The buzz of excitement filled the air like static. Carl walked slowly, scanning the crowd, keeping his head down, not because he was ashamed, but because this wasn't his world. He wasn't a teacher or a parent or a school board member. He was just a man who mopped the floors when everyone else had gone home. He found a spot in the back row of the far section, beneath a swaying flag and a speaker that crackled with feedback. From there, he could see the rows of students in their caps and gowns lined up near the stage. The sea of blue fabric shimmered in the sunlight. He spotted Marcus almost immediately. The boy, no, the young man now, stood tall, his tassel brushing his brow, eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, Carl thought he might be searching for him, but then Marcus turned back to his classmates, laughing quietly at something one of them said. Carl smiled to himself. That laughter, it was new, lighter, like a weight had finally lifted. No one noticed Carl, not the teachers in their robes, not the families posing for photos, not even the usher who had glanced at his ticket and waved him through without a second look. And that too felt right, because Carl wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see. To watch a boy he once fed in silence walk across a stage that almost never would have held him. To witness the quiet ending of one story and the louder, brighter beginning of another. He folded his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on the stage, the hum of the crowd rising all around him. He didn't need a spotlight. He'd spent his whole life in the shadows. But today, in the warmth of a stadium filled with joy, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the graduates' faces as they sat in neat rows, tassels swaying gently in the breeze. The principal gave a few parting words, the crowd clapped, and then Marcus Hayes was called to the stage. He stepped up to the podium with steady hands and a folded sheet of paper in his pocket, one he barely glanced at as he looked out over the sea of people. His voice, when it came, was clear, strong, measured. "Good evening, everyone. Teachers, parents, friends, and those who never got their thank you." There was a pause, a quiet tension. He took a breath. "When I started at Brookdale High, I didn't have a home. I didn't have stability. I didn't have anyone waiting for me at the end of the day." He scanned the crowd slowly until his eyes landed near the back, on a man in a too-big tie with worn hands folded neatly in his lap. "But I did have someone." A ripple went through the audience. He didn't wear a suit or sit in a classroom. He didn't teach algebra or give detentions. He cleaned up after the rest of us had gone home. He left food on a table without a name attached. He sat with me in silence when I didn't know how to ask for help. Marcus's voice grew softer, but it never wavered. "Everything I am is because of one man who reminded me, every single day, that I mattered, even when I didn't believe it myself." He turned toward the back of the stadium, and this time his words were for one person alone. "Carl Evans." Gasps echoed across the rows. Heads turned. Carl felt every eye shift toward him, but he didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at Marcus, frozen in place, his throat tightening as his name, his full name, rang through speakers meant for winners and heroes. "I wouldn't be here without you," Marcus continued. "You didn't just clean the school. You helped me build a future." The crowd was silent for a beat too long. Then someone stood, and then another. Applause erupted, real, raw, thunderous. Carl blinked hard, his vision blurred. He'd come to stay invisible, but for the first time in his life he was seen, fully, clearly, not as a janitor, but as the man who made everything possible. For a moment Carl couldn't move. He sat there, still as stone, as Marcus's words echoed in his ears, as if the world had gone impossibly quiet inside his chest, even as the stadium erupted around him. First, it was the teachers. Mrs. Patel, who had known Marcus since freshman year, was the first to rise. Then, Mr. Dunning, the science club sponsor. One by one, they stood, clapping not out of politeness, but something deeper. Recognition, respect. Then the parents followed, dozens of them, rising with their cameras forgotten at their sides, hands coming together in powerful, unrelenting applause. Students were last, some who barely knew Carl, others who'd only seen him pushing a mop, sweeping up their messes. But they rose too, clapping, whistling, cheering his name. Carl, Carl, Carl. Carl sat stunned in the middle of it all, eyes wide, hands trembling in his lap. The sound rolled over him like a wave, undeniable, impossible, real. He'd never heard applause for anything he'd done, not once, and now it filled an entire stadium. He stood slowly, unsure, overwhelmed, and when he did, the applause only grew louder. Marcus smiled from the podium, but he didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The silence he left behind was a gift, a space where the crowd could speak for him, with hands and hearts. Carl's face burned with a heat he hadn't felt in years. His throat clenched around something too big for words. He gave a small nod, humble and awkward, the way only someone who'd never expected the spotlight could. One hand to his chest, one to the air. He didn't know how to stand in a moment like this. But the crowd stood with him. In that single breathless minute, Carl Evans, the man no one noticed, the man who gave quietly without ever asking for anything in return, was seen. Not as background, not as staff, but as the reason someone's story had a second chapter. And in that thunderous, undeniable ovation, he finally understood. Kindness does echo. Sometimes all the way to the center of a stadium. The video was posted that same evening. Shaky, vertical footage from a parent's phone, capturing Marcus's speech as his voice carried across the stadium, the exact moment he said Carl's name, the wave of the crowd rising to its feet. Within 24 hours, it had 100,000 views. By the end of the week, it had passed 1 million. Headlines followed. Janitor honored by valedictorian in viral graduation speech. The quiet hero behind one student's success. A man named Carl, the janitor who changed a life. Carl didn't have social media. He didn't own a computer. But even he couldn't avoid it. Strangers began leaving thank you notes at the school's front desk. Letters from veterans, single parents, kids who'd grown up in shelters. All of them moved by the idea that someone, somewhere, had helped without ever expecting anything in return. News vans parked outside Brookdale High. Journalists requested interviews. One morning, a local anchor cornered Carl in the parking lot, microphone already extended. "Mr. Evans, how does it feel to be a national hero?" Carl blinked against the cameras. "I'm not," he said quietly. "I just didn't want the kid to go hungry." He walked away before they could ask anything else. He didn't like the attention. Never had. He kept his head down, kept working, slipping through side doors when he had to. He turned down interviews, declined speaking events, ignored invitations to TV morning shows and education panels. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He just didn't want the story to become about him. To him, it had always been about Marcus, about showing up when someone needed you, about doing the thing no one else saw. He hadn't helped so someone could clap. He'd helped because once, a long time ago, someone hadn't. Still, the world kept noticing. A school board resolution passed in his name. The district created a small grant for at-risk students, the Carl Evans Persistence Fund. But Carl kept showing up the same way he always had, long before sunrise, quiet, reliable, anonymous if he could help it. He smiled when people waved, nodded when they thanked him. But the mop still moved the same. The cart still squeaked down the hallway. And the man behind it still believed that the most powerful thing you can do for someone is care when nobody's watching. Spring melted into summer, and the campus slowly emptied. Lockers cleared, classrooms quieted. But Marcus's name stayed on everyone's lips a little longer than most. Not because he was valedictorian, but because of what came after. The announcement came in a plain envelope. A full-ride scholarship to one of the top engineering programs in the state. Tuition, housing, books, covered. The essay he'd written about Carl had done more than move hearts. It had opened doors. When Carl heard, he didn't say much, just smiled and nodded. And later that night, alone in the supply closet, let the quiet swell in his chest like pride wrapped in flannel. He didn't need to say it out loud. Marcus had done it. He'd made it out. But something else was brewing behind the scenes, something Carl didn't know about. A few teachers, along with Principal Reynolds and Mrs. Delaney, had submitted his name for the county's Community Pillar Award, a recognition reserved for those who quietly built bridges no one else saw. Volunteers, foster parents, bus drivers who bought kids winter coats. This year, it was a janitor. Carl didn't even know he'd been nominated until a letter arrived at his apartment, typed in formal language and stamped with a gold seal. He read it 3 times before he understood what it meant. And when he stood on the small stage at the town hall auditorium a few weeks later, dressed in the same pressed shirt from graduation, the crowd of community members gave him the same standing ovation he'd received in the stadium, only softer, more personal. Marcus was there, sitting in the front row with his backpack by his feet and a grin stretched across his face. Carl didn't give a speech. When they handed him the plaque and waited for him to approach the mic, he simply said, "Thank you," and stepped back. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Marcus approached him with an envelope of his own. "Letters of recommendation," he said, handing it over. "For you. I think you should apply to be on the school board facilities committee. You've already done more for this place than half the people who've ever held a title." Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "I'm not built for meetings." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but you're built for people." Carl didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just looked at the boy-turned-man in front of him, the one who used to hide behind a book in the corner of a library, and saw what had come full circle. Not just the success, not just the scholarship, but the legacy of a quiet, relentless kindness, echoing forward in someone strong enough now to carry it further. The school was silent again. That deep, after-hours quiet that Carl had always known, the kind that settled into the corners and hummed beneath the floor tiles. Summer break had begun. The lockers were empty. The classroom still smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old paper. Carl moved slowly through the halls, not because there was work to do, he'd already done it, but because some part of him didn't want to leave just yet. When he reached the library, he hesitated. The lights were off, the door unlocked. He stepped inside. Everything was just as it had been. The long tables, the quiet rows of books, the same scuffed chair in the corner, the one Marcus always used. Carl made his way to it, fingers brushing the table's edge, worn smooth over years of use. Then he noticed the envelope, a plain white one, resting exactly where the sandwich used to go. His name was written in neat handwriting across the front. Carl. He opened it carefully, the way you'd unfold a memory you weren't quite ready to feel. Inside was a letter. "Dear Carl, you probably knew I'd leave something behind. You always saw things before anyone else did. I didn't get to say everything at graduation. Not really. And I figured this was the right place, the place where it all started. You gave me more than help. You gave me belief. In myself. In people. In the idea that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't all cold corners and closed doors. You didn't owe me anything. You didn't ask anything from me. You just showed up. And that made all the difference. When I teach someone else one day, or help someone who's struggling like I was, it'll be because of you. You were my first example of what it means to matter without being seen. Thank you. I hope you never stop leaving lights on for people who don't yet know they're welcome. Marcus." Carl sat down in the chair across from the one Marcus had always used. The letter rested between his hands, trembling just slightly. Outside, the cicadas buzzed. The world went on. But in that quiet library, Carl let himself feel it. Every echo, every moment, every small act that had added up to this. The library was empty now, but it had never been fuller. And in the stillness, Carl smiled, not because it was over, but because it had mattered.